Let me mention a third aspect of what it seems to me is important to be a person, and that is to have a sense of identity. To be able to say I in a meaningful and authentic way, rather than to feel as the one, as Heidegger has originally formulated it, as one of the mass, as a coin which bears the same stamp as all other coins, and yet has the illusion to be entirely different from all other coins. This phenomenon of lack of identity has been described perhaps most clearly also already in the 19th century, where some remarkable people have seen what will become of man more clearly than man sees it when he has become it. The one I'm referring to now is Ibsen in his Peer Gynt. Peer Gynt is a normal man. He is successful. He is a trader. He follows his self-interest, only to discover at the end of his life that he never was himself, that he has no self, that he has no identity, that he is, in order to use Ibsen's symbol, an onion which one can peel and peel and peel, and there is no kernel. And at that point, Peer Gynt is seized by the horror of the nothing, by the horror of sensing that he is not he, and he would rather be burned in the fires of hell than to return to the melting pots in the awareness that there is no sense of his own identity. A modern writer, Kafka, has described the same phenomenon in The Trial, which I'm sure most of you know. There too, K is a perfectly normal man. He has no problems, except he has that long dream which fills the book of Kafka, the Trial. He's perfectly normal, and yet he is profoundly sick, but he's not aware of it, except in the dream or in the symbolic novel which Kafka writes about him. Now, again, it has to be said that our lack of sense of identity leads to another phenomenon, and that is the obsessional need to conform with everybody else. Naturally, if I do not know who I am, then I have to join the herd in order to be sure that I'm somebody, that I am at least like the rest, that I have a place somewhere, that I'm not completely disoriented. If I have a strongly developed sense of I do not need to have an obsessional need to be part of the herd, because my role in the world is given by my own experience of I. Most of you know the problem of identity has become the study among a number of psychologists and psychoanalysts in recent years. Perhaps the best known author in this field has been Professor Erickson. But again, I believe a great deal more can be done to study the problem of identity in modern man. And I come now to a fourth aspect of being a person, an aspect which I should like to describe by saying to be a person requires not to be the prisoner of unconscious forces which drive one. To be free in a deeper than the merely political sense. To make the unconscious conscious, at least to a large extent. To be aware, or as Freud put it, where there is id, there shall be ego. Or you might even still put it in a simpler form. That is simply to say, to see the reality inside me and the reality outside of myself. After all, there is no such thing as the unconscious, as a place. There is only a function. I am either conscious or I am unconscious of certain experiences, of certain things which I sense inside of myself or outside of myself. That really means I either see or I don't see. I'm blind. And to make the unconscious conscious simply means to be more in touch with the reality inside of myself or outside of myself. After all, let us not forget, most of what is real is not conscious, and most of what is conscious is fiction. We are not aware that it is a fiction because it's a fiction shared by everybody, and hence people believe the fiction is true. Because our whole concept of reality is essentially one based on consensus and not on a critical examination of what is really real. Actually, it has been a tendency, the thought of the last 2 or 3 centuries in science, in philosophy, to get a closer answer to the question, what is really real? And not just in a philosophical sense, but what is really real in one's mind, in matter, and these are the questions with which psychoanalysis and theoretical physics have occupied themselves. If man is motivated by his unconscious without his knowledge, and that is what most of us are, we are like the persons in the Greek drama, whose fate is already decided, who have no freedom to form their own destiny, and who only live under the illusion that they have that freedom when in reality everything occurs according to a foreordained plot. But it has been from the Hebrew prophets on to our day the tendency of Western man as well as of the great religions of the East, especially of Buddhism, to enlarge man's freedom by making him more aware of his own inner realities, of the forces which drive him. And the one who has made the basic discoveries in a more detailed and scientific sense is, of course, Freud. No need here to talk about Freud. I think the thoughts about man will never be the same since Freud wrote his basic works. But naturally, Freud was, like every genius, also a son of his time. In his thinking, he was largely determined by a mechanistic materialism which tried to see psychic realities represented mainly by the mechanisms of instincts which Freud saw in a certain sense essentially as libido or later as death instinct and life instinct. I believe that by this narrowness of his philosophy, he was forced very often to restrict the richness of his own discoveries because the frame of reference he had did not permit him to widen it further. But no genius ever has transcended his epoch in a sense that he could foresee what possibilities existed for his own discoveries even half a century later. And furthermore, it is true that 50 years ago, sexual desires were certainly in the middle class, never in the upper class, very much repressed. That was a characteristic of the Victorian age. But I think there is a rather widespread agreement that today sexual desires and fantasies are not so repressed anymore. Some of us may even wish they were a little bit more repressed. Sex has become, like everything else, an article of consumption. In fact, a very accessible and cheap one. But there are other things in men of today which are repressed. They have a very different nature. What is repressed today is an enormous boredom most of us have with life. In fact, that most of us are capable to listen to television for hours is the best proof how bored we must be if we accept this food voluntarily. What is repressed is a deep sense of isolation, of loneliness. What is repressed is an intense anxiety, an anxiety which has led the poet Auden to call our century the century of anxiety. What is repressed is a sense of inner emptiness, is a sense of lacking any guidance about the meaning of life. I believe in order to apply the basic discoveries of Freud to the problems of man today, we need to transcend his frame of reference of what is repressed, what is the unconscious, and we need to emphasize more than he has done, although he has done it, the social character of that which is conscious and that which is repressed. To be a little bit more specific about what I mean here with the social character, I should like to say that all these phenomena, the boredom, the isolation, the anxiety, the powerlessness, are produced by our way of life. They are results of the industrial society as it is constituted. Why this is so certainly is not a topic which I could deal with within this lecture. It is also a topic to which certainly I don't have the answers, but it is a topic which should be studied by many psychologists, perhaps often in cooperation with sociologists, to understand why this society in which we live produces these emotional experiences. It is easier to say why they have to be repressed. Because if we were aware of our anxiety, of our sense of isolation, of our sense of impotence, if we were aware of it, we could hardly go on functioning as the society expects from us to function. In fact, I would think that even if for 1 week you would stop all television, radio, games, and conversation, you would have probably hundreds of thousands of nervous breakdowns. Or at least you would have suddenly people be very aware of all these things which are usually repressed. The reason why people are not aware of them lies to a large extent in this phenomenon, that the very society which produces these experiences also produces the compensations which permit to keep them repressed. That is to say, essentially, our entertainment industry and our consumption culture. By the process of being the perfect consumer, man saves himself from the awareness of his anxiety. To the clinician, this is by no means something surprising, because we know that many people who have an intense anxiety without being aware of it overeat or develop a habit of compulsive buying. By doing this, they compensate the anxiety in such a way that they protect themselves from being aware of it.